Sir, you can start, sir. Gopal, sir.
Good evening, members. Good evening, sir. On behalf of the SIRC of ICI, I welcome you all for the seminar on recent trends in transfer pricing. We have with us CA Mitlesh Reddy. Sri Mitlesh is a practicing chartered accountant, a qualified advocate, certified professional in international taxation and forensics audit, and possesses over 13 years of experience in assisting clients on taxation, transfer pricing, regulatory matters, advisory, and litigation. His experience in transfer pricing is on advisory, TP documentation, representation before TP authorities, in TPO, DRP, CIT appeals, and ITAT. Experienced in filing advance pricing agreements, application on related assignments, global transfer pricing review for multinationals, planning for BEPS, CBCR requirements, and preparing master file and local file documentations, preparing dispute resolution panel, application, drafting appeal, document, and representation before DRP panel and commissioner appeal. His key credentials are expertise in litigation handling, represented more than 50 tribunal appeals before Hyderabad ITAT, more than 100 CIT appeals, and DRP filing and representations. Core experience in transfer pricing, planning, advisory, documentation, and advisory for multinational in transaction structuring, evaluation of models, and providing analysis on most efficient alternatives, performing compliance support and providing virtual CFO services to more than 100 plus companies. He's a regular speaker and a presenter in discussion paper on various topics in international taxation, transfer pricing, regulatory matters, performing leadership role in a firm with almost around 100 people in Hyderabad. With this view, I would like to introduce CA Mitlesh Reddy to this seminar and welcome you, sir, on behalf of SIRC and on behalf of all the members. And it's over to you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Gopal Krishnan, sir. Let's get on with the topic. Yeah. So, hi everyone. My name is Mithilesh, and I hope the introduction and all are done. So we'll move on to the topic. As we can see, today we are going to talk on transfer pricing, the inception, evolution, the future topics that are going to come to India, and also the litigation part of it as well. So these are the core topics that we are going to discuss in the next 2 hours. I'll give a pause for the last 20 minutes or 30 minutes possibly to take over the questions. So whatever questions you have, you can put it in the chat box and or also send it to the organizer there, so that we can take up all the questions at once at the end. So coming to the topic today, on the transfer pricing aspect, what exactly is transfer pricing? If at all a transaction takes place between two related parties and independent parties altogether. So when a transaction takes place between independent parties and a transaction takes place between related parties, the related party transaction is called as transfer price, and the independent transaction is called as an arm's length price. So how are we going to justify the transactions of goods, services, intangibles, loans, and guarantees between related parties through the arm's length price is the subject of transfer pricing. Now, when we ask the question of how to arrive at arm's length and what exactly is arm's length, the Indian transfer pricing regulations have specified a specific section called section 92 and chapter 10 for the detailed analysis and the conceptual clarity that is required, and also the methods in which you can arrive at the arm's length price. Now, the price applied or proposed to be applied in a transaction between persons or the other than AEs is said to be the arm's length price. Earlier, the arm's length range as such was 1% in a wholesaler and 3% in all other cases. But now, with the Finance Act 2016 onwards, it has been replaced with a range called as a percentile range, 35th percentile to 65th percentile, which we will discuss in detail. Now, how to arrive at the arm's length price through the prescribed methods. and the applicability as such, which we're going to discuss in the next 5 to 10 slides. Coming to the applicability, for whom this transfer pricing subject as such applies, is whenever a transaction is happening between related parties, whenever a transaction is falling within the definition of associated enterprise as per 92A, and a transaction, international transaction, which is defined in 92B. So what exactly are these associated enterprises and international transactions? We will discuss now. But once it is applicable, what are the compliances, what are the burden, what is the obligation on part of the assessee is what we need to actually evaluate. Now, in terms of the consequences or the obligations on part of the taxpayer, there requires to be a justification for the arm's length price. There requires to be a maintenance of documentation, and accountant certificate, with the chartered accountant certificate, has to be filed online, justifying or subjecting the details, the name of the transaction, with which party, what is the price, under which method are you justifying, and what are the various factual details of such transaction have to be disclosed in the accountant's report. Now, in order, if what will happen if I don't comply with these compliances that I just mentioned, we will look at the penalty sections and also how the regulatory authorities are going to look at it in a assessment procedure kind of a situation. Now, coming back to what is an international transaction, what is the applicability, and what is arm's length again. Now, the preliminary part of the 92(1) talks about an international transaction. Any income arising from an international transaction has to be computed having regard to the arm's length price, and for any expense or interest as well. Now, when any income or expense or an interest or a transaction happens between two related parties, it has to be subjected to arm's length price. Is the forward or the basic fundamental of the transfer pricing law. Now, can we apply it in a reverse situation where I'm applying this arm's length principle? Can I downward revise the transaction values or subject it to a lower tax? There is a probability section or a prerogative section which talks about 92(3), which intends to make it very clear that any determination of this arm's length price should not reduce the income chargeable to tax or increase the loss. If you are more, it is okay, but you should not take the shelter of these transfer pricing provisions to safeguard yourselves and say that I'll pay less tax or the transaction value is revised because of an arm's length price. Now, what is an international transaction? In terms of an international transaction, the tangible property, the intangible property, capital financing, provision of services, and business restructuring, these are the 5 different phases in which the international transaction definition is provided in the 92B section. Now, coming to the tangible property, anything which you can look, feel, observe, or transfer, these kind of land, building, vehicles, these are tangible. This we can clearly identify, and any layman can specifically say that this is a tangible property. But the main litigation or the main confusion that is happening in the international transaction definition is on the intangible property and the capital financing clause, and maybe a bit on the business restructuring aspect. Now, coming to the intangible property, why I was specifying that there was litigation in this is, intangible property definition is a bit open-sided. I mean, it is open definition. It will include the transfer of manpower. It may include any kind of copyright, IP. It might include a commercial right. It might include any other property other than the tangible property. So it is an open this thing. So most of the chartered accountants or most of the companies ask me this question on, we are moving our employees from one unit to the other or one entity to the other because of a merger or because of our internal slump sale transaction. Should we report this transaction? Should we actually, I'm actually selling my IP to my parent entity. Should I report this transaction? I'm actually acquiring a goodwill, or I'm actually acquiring a specific, patent from my foreign company. Should I actually make myself disclose this transaction? And any kind of enhancement or maintenance, protection or exploitation that is happening on this particular intangible property also has to be disclosed. This is famously called as DEMPE function on the intangible under the base erosion profit shifting language of the OECD. We will come to that a little bit later. But why am I specifying on this intangible property is it is the most litigated across now in India as well as globally, because of the definition, because of the exploitation royalties or the kind of storage that these IPs are being subjected to at present. Coming to the financing aspect of it, most of the loan syndications, the loan arrangements, the debt arrangements, the guarantees, as well as advances and receivables and payables are required to be disclosed as per this definition. When they talk about this specific definition on capital financing, they have left it open-ended, saying that any kind of receivable payable during the course of business. So this is the language when you read section 92B that appears. Now, in this particular language, the main confusion that is happening is whether the receivable payable is subjected to a closely linked transaction for the service transaction or for my principal transaction. Should I again benchmark it? Should I again disclose it separately? The answer, as far as the litigation is concerned, or after 2012 amendment to this particular clause or explanation to this particular section 92B is concerned, is the government has been pushing us towards disclosure of receivable, any kind of receivables and payables. And if there is a loan transaction, how much interest have you been subjecting it to? How much interest have you been paying to the parent entity? In terms of the transaction in the guarantee, most probably most of the entities, Indian parent entities, when they give an outbound guarantee, when they give guarantee to their subsidiaries, they don't charge any kind of commission on this particular guarantee. So because it's an interlinked or it's a intercompany kind of a intra-group transaction, where their argument is that without my guarantee, my subsidiary would not get a loan in the foreign jurisdiction, and it's a ownership or a capital infuser responsibility, then that is the reason I'm giving a guarantee. But as far as the government is concerned, they have been raising queries on the commission that is required to be charged on the guarantee transaction as such. We will discuss about this litigation points in the transfer pricing litigation segment when we go a bit detailed in about half an hour stuff time. But I'm just giving you a glimpse on the definition aspects that are being subjected to litigation here. On provision of services, most of them, and especially in the southern regions, the market is tilted towards the service segment in terms of IT, ITS, marketing support, business support services, engineering design services, scientific research, and any kind of back office IT-enabled services. So this is how the service segment is. Any service that a group entity from India is providing to the global, or any service which is being availed by the Indian entity from the global, has to be subjected to transfer pricing requirement. Now, in terms of a business restructuring, most of us, when we are reading the section for the first time, we might come across it in such a situation or in such a way that we understand that it is a amalgamation or a demerger or any kind of restructuring aspect that might happen. But from a true transfer pricing objective perspective or a response perspective, the main criteria that this definition tries to cover is on any kind of changes that happen within the organization in terms of change in the pricing methodology, change in the functional analysis, change in the entire restructuring of the supply chain. So even these transactions are subjected to transfer pricing, and we need to justify why we have reduced the price as compared to the previous supply chain to the current supply chain, as compared to the previous cost plus to the current cost plus, as compared to the previous functional analysis to the current functional analysis. So this is one of the litigative aspect where most of the companies have not been disclosing, and even the tax authorities, for tax authorities also, it is very difficult to prove or benchmark these kind of transactions. So even if it is not disclosed, it is going unnoticed sometimes, is what I can say. Now, coming to the definition of associated enterprise, who are the related parties? How the associated enterprise definition is there in the transfer pricing law of the income tax. Now, any kind of ownership, management, control, and capital, the definitions itself if they are coming together in this particular direct and indirect participation, this 92A section comes into picture. In the holding perspective, in the management perspective, in terms of cross holding, in terms of capital, in terms of directors, in terms of participation, in terms of decision making, if at all the threshold limits are satisfied, then this is the whole threshold limit criteria that I am talking about. In terms of more than 26% holding, in terms of loans being given more than 51% of the total assets, in terms of guarantees 10% or more of the debt, in terms of interest if it is being paid of more than 10% of interest, and if you are influenced by the pricing and terms and conditions because of dependency on the consumption of more than 90% of your raw materials being purchased from a single entity, then also the associated enterprise comes into pictures. These are some of the quantified or defined quantum numbers or the segmented or clearly defined definitions for an associated enterprise to come into picture. Now, once there is a associated enterprise definition satisfaction, once there is a international transaction definition satisfaction, then the transfer pricing law automatically applies. Now, coming to a variation in a associated enterprise, say suppose the A entity is there in India and there is a third party in India which is dealing with A, but this third party has entered into an agreement with A's parent and says that these both are agreeing into master supply or master service agreement, but A's parent asks the company A in India to deliver the services to the third party in India. So for a neutral person, for a chartered accountant or for the regulatory authority as well, this transaction appears to be a domestic transaction. It doesn't appear to be an international transaction because third party supply, third party payment, everything is clear. So there is no scope of related party. But this entire supply and the payment happened because of a prior agreement between the parent and the third party. Now, in these circumstances, whenever there is a prior agreement at a global level with any of the A's associated enterprises globally and the third party in India, and the terms of the transactions are determined by the substance of A's parent and third party, then this kinds of transaction domestically will also be subjected to transfer pricing, which is called as deemed international transaction. There is a specific clause for this deemed international transaction in the form 3CB, and it requires disclosure, and this is on par with any other related party transaction directly. So it has to be disclosed that even though they are dealing with a third party in India, this particular transaction has to be disclosed as good as doing this transaction on behalf of the parent. So this has to be disclosed as a related party, benchmark, documented, and complied with all the transfer pricing requirements in India. Now, we are talking only about the global transfer pricing or the international transfer pricing till now. In India, way back in 2012 Finance Act or 2013-14 assessment year Finance Act, they have introduced a domestic transfer pricing segment also. What they have said is any transaction which you are dealing with a domestic related party, which the related party definition there has been subjected to the definition of 40A2B, wherein the relationships are in terms of the any relative or the director of a company or holding stakes directly or indirectly, or whatever definition that 40A2B has, the general specific related party disclosure section. This definition has been brought about, and they have said that if you are having any of these transactions, then the transfer pricing law will apply on you, and you have to justify your arm's length price, and you have to maintain documentation. It was done with the right spirit, but where the threshold limit or the applicability was started from 5 crores initially, then it was increased to 20 crores, and later in 2016, this particular 40A2B clause in the 92BA specified domestic transaction section has been completely done away with. So what they have come up in the latest amendments is that only if one of the dealing parties, either the seller or the purchaser, either the service provider or recipient, if any of them are being subjected to a tax holiday, if they are enjoying any of the tax holiday, then if you are dealing with that tax holiday or you yourself are claiming a tax holiday, then only your disclosure from a transfer pricing perspective comes into picture. So what they have clearly specified is, if at all you are having a transaction with the related party domestically, and if that entity or yourself are claiming any tax holiday, then only you are required to be disclosing domestic transfer pricing transactions from 2016 onwards, provided your entire transaction value exceeds 20 crores. Now, why this particular section has this kind of requirement if any of the entities are claiming a tax holiday? What people used to plan earlier is that on one entity, wherever there was a tax holiday, they used to park all their profits in that particular entity and claim the expenditures, purchases, and losses in the tax paying entity. So they used to take advantage of the tax holiday claiming units or entities, and they used to park all the losses and payments in the tax paying entities. So they used to reduce the effective tax rate in such a way. So the government has plugged in this loophole by removing the regular 48(2)B requirement. Anyways, this 48(2)B requirement comes in the tax audit report or in the disclosures, and it's a mandatory disclosure. So why to club this 48(2)B in the transfer pricing provisions? So keep the transfer pricing provisions restricted to the tax holiday claim, and be clear on the applicability is what I think the intention of the government is, which is a welcome move. But however, if the 48(2)B provision is not impelled back, or if it is not brought back into the transfer pricing law, there is a huge planning that is possible if at all multiple layer companies are being created, and if the 20 crore transaction or 5 crore transaction, the threshold limits are planned properly, still from A to B, B to C, C to D, the transactions can still be planned. So there is a contemplation that they might get back this, but there is a vague chance. So this is about the domestic transfer pricing evolution and what changes the government has brought in 92BA. Coming to the transfer pricing methods, there are 6 methods in total where the justification can be done from an arm's length perspective. The first 3 methods, which are called as traditional transaction methods, are the comparable uncontrolled price, resale price, and cost plus method. The transactional profits methods are profit split method and transactional net margin method. And the residuary method is the other method. Most prevalent and mostly used method is the transactional net margin method. But however, whenever the 3CEB the certifications are being given, I observe most of the chartered accountants going for comparable uncontrolled price method. When each method is applicable in what circumstances and what are the challenges, we will just go through each of the methods. While selecting comparables, before we move on in detail about each of the method, how to identify the comparable? What is a comparable? Well, now in terms of the comparability, what is your transaction first in terms of the facts? What is your risk? What is your terms and conditions? What kind of quality? What kind of region? What kind of factual criteria that you are in terms of your transaction with the related party has to be documented, and then the comparable criteria will come into picture. Once this comparable criteria is matching, these comparables can be in the open domain in terms of the customs websites, in terms of the open market traded listed prices, as well as the transfer pricing subject as such has a lot of databases globally, and in India most prevalent databases are Probus, Kaplan, and ACE, but recently most of them have been using RoyaltyStat and also and other Oriana and other jurisdictional the databases as well. But once these criteria are identified, once these criteria are inserted into the databases, or once these criteria are shortlisted for among all the reasonable comparables that we have, we will be able to arrive at the accurate comparables. So then the pricing, the averages, the comparability of the quantification of the pricing can be done. Now coming to the first method, which we call as comparable uncontrolled price method. This is mostly an apple to apple comparison method. So there has to be a neck to neck comparison in terms of the color, size, functions, region, and it has to be 100% comparable. Then only the comparable uncontrolled price method can be used. It's a strict comparability, and most probably it might be used in a situation where there is 100% comparability in all the aspects. So this is the most toughest, and in terms of the justification aspect, even if there is minor differences, then it has to be it should not be adopted. If that differences can be quantified and adjusted, then the adjustments calculation and the specific justifications also have to be documented along with the cup applicability. Now there are two types of cups, internal cup and external cup. In terms of internal cup, I am a manufacturer and I deal with a related party, and I also deal with a third party. I produce the same kind of good or service, and there is 100% chance that these are the same companies and these are the same justifications which I can give. So this is the internal comparable which I can pick up. In terms of external cup, so if I am producing it to two non-related parties and I'm also producing it to a related party from outside, so that is party B is dealing with some third party, and party A, I am dealing with a non-related party. Whenever there is a related party transaction internally, in the internal comparability is available for the manufacturer A, then the internal comparison can be done. And if the external comparison has to happen, it has the supplier and the purchaser, the service provider and the recipient has to be third parties. So this third party transaction from a completely independent perspective has to be picked up whenever we are going for an external cup. Now the reseller price method, the second method. In terms of the reseller price method, this method is applicable mostly for trading entities. In terms of applicability of the gross margins, whenever Indian entity is purchasing from a related party and then distributing it to third parties here in India, resale price method is most prevalent. It is the PLI, the profit level indicator for this particular method would be the gross margin, and how much margin are you making would be tested with independent comparable companies or independent comparable transactions. Why, when I've said gross margin, is the related party purchase price has to be compared with the direct sales price that you are going to do. So the direct cost on the sales price which you are selling it to the domestic segment will give you the gross margin, and how much margin are you going to arrive by doing this trading activity between the related party and third party in India would be subjected to test in an independent situation when both unrelated parties are dealing for this distribution activity. So this method is applicable for a trader. This method is applicable in terms of gross margin evaluation. This method is applicable in terms of whenever Indian entity is purchasing from a related party and selling it to third party distributors, and how much margin is being arrived at by the Indian entity in terms of the sales price to third parties minus the direct cost, which include the purchase price from the related party. So in summary, this is the applicability of the resale price method. And the resale price method mostly is applicable and the adjustments to this related party or the resale price method is very, very difficult. But in terms of the customs duty transactions or the list price transactions which third parties have been evaluating for similar trading entities, this data can be pulled up very, very easily. Coming to the cost plus method, this method is applicable where manufacturing entities are producing, and if the manufacturing cost or direct costs are clearly identifiable and quantified. Whenever the manufacturing entity is supplying any kind of finished goods or semi-finished goods, the markup over and above the direct cost, what it is deploying in supplying it to the related party supplier or the related party retailer is what we would be requiring. In terms of the manufacturing entity, this method is applicable. The gross margin that it is generating over and above the direct cost versus the sales price that it can generate is the method. Whereas CPM is applicable in terms of internal comparison, where the manufacturing of same good is being done for a related party as well as for a third party. Now, identification of the normal gross margin with reference to the uncontrolled transaction is a third party manufacturing that you can take up within your unit. Now, a segmental analysis can be done in terms of the sales price for the related party, third party, in terms of the direct cost comparison for the related party and third party, and what kind of gross margin that the entity is, which is manufacturing these products, has to be done. So the comparison there has to happen at a gross level for a manufacturer who is manufacturing goods for both related party and third party. Now, profit split method is one of the most complicated methods and most, very few times this method comes into picture or it can be justified. Why? Because if there are transactions which are combined or where they are intrinsically linked transactions. I'll give an example for application of profit split method. If a bridge is being constructed in Paris by an Indian EPC entity, the main capital goes from India. The architect comes from Australia with a group entity. The material is being supplied from Japan, and any kind of engineering design services are coming from Philippines. So 5 of the group entities are putting in their best qualities, and then the manufacture or the bridge construction takes place in Paris. Now, for a particular product to come up, if 5 group entities are providing their own contributions, then how come the profit split has to happen? In these kind of intrinsically linked transactions, the division of the functions performed, risk assumed has to happen, and then the profit allocation among these entities has to happen in those ratios. So first, when we arrive at the combined net profit of the Paris entity, say suppose where the bridge is constructed, this particular profit has to be split among the 5 group entities which have contributed or responded by giving their best possible resources that they have. Now, how do we do that, and how the margins can be split around these 5 entities is based on the contributions that they have given. For capital, how much weightage would be given in terms of the risk appetite that the company has, in terms of the credit rating that the company has. If the same would have been borrowed and gone for that particular project execution, how much opportunity cost that it would have cost to the group, and the availability of capital among all the other entities. Based on these parameters, if at all a weight is given, capital would be on the front end, and how much cost plus or how much contribution the engineering design service segment, how much contribution the material supply guy would have done, how much contribution the architect would have done. Based on this weightage and based on the contribution criteria, the splitting of combined net profit among the group entities would be done. Now, coming to the transactional net margin, this particular method, as I mentioned, would be a net margin method in terms of the comparison of the net margin of the related party transactions, which will be compared with the third party public domain data in terms of the similar comparables. Once we have the comparability criteria clear, then we can apply those filters and go for transfer pricing databases like Provis, Kaplan, and ACE, and find out similar companies which are there in the similar industry doing the same kind of transactions with independent parties. Now, in terms of the identification of comparable transactions, when we arrive at these filters, and once we shortlist the companies, and once we have the averages done under the transaction net margin method, the tolerance range that I've just spoken about, 35th percentile to 65th percentile, will come into picture. So once your margin is falling within the 35th percentile to 65th percentile, or your margin is more than the range as such, then you are called to be at arm's length. So that's how the transaction net margin method would work. First, you need to arrive at the net margin of your transaction, then compare this net margin with the comparables that have been shortlisted by application of filters in the Provis, Kaplan, and ACE databases. And from there, the average of the net profits of the shortlisted companies has to be arrived at, and what margin that these entities as a related party has arrived, when what margin the independent companies have arrived, will be compared. And if it is falling within the arm's length of 35th percentile to 65th percentile, then this transaction would be called as an arm's length. And if the margins are lower than the 35th percentile to 65th percentile, then there will be a adjustment as such. But if it is more than the arm's length range, then it is also left out, and there is no possibility of bringing down the margin of the related party, like how we discussed in 92.3. Now, coming to the 35th percentile to 65th percentile, I'll explain the tolerance range background as well. We'll finish off the last method and we'll get into the 35% and 6 percentile. In terms of the residuary method, the other method criteria, this method is called as a residuary method and it was introduced in 2016 only. And this is the method where the justifications in all the 5 methods are not possible. And if it is an open market quotation, valuation report, tender bidding document, and a transactional margin justification method, which clearly gives you a picture on how the margin would be and what the price that would have been charged if a similar transaction would have taken place. So the difference between CUP method and other method is CUP is a method where you are actually comparing 2 transactions which have actually happened. In terms of other method, the comparison will happen for a transaction which has happened with a related party, and the comparison will happen if at all this transaction would have happened with independent parties. Would have happened with independent parties, what would be the price? So when you go for an open market quotation, when you go for a valuation report, when you go for a standard card conceptualization, then your pricing would be compared. So wherever the comparability purposes are flexible, wherever the comparability requirements do not satisfy the requirements of any of the 5 methods, the residuary method can be used, which is called as another method. Now, coming to the tolerance range that I was talking about, once you crystallize or finalize the comparables. Now, earlier, the plus or minus 5% used to be there till 2013-14. Now, in 2013, they have brought up this amendment, which says that the 5% would be reduced to 1% for wholesalers and 3% for all other cases. So why 1% for wholesalers is because of the purchase cost being 80% of the total activity. The range can be knocked off at a gross level, and hence the 1% lower range, the initiation of the 1% has been given for wholesale activity. In terms of the 3% for all other retailers, service providers, any other residuary category, has restricted the flexibility of the arm's length price calculation. So this tolerance range was from 2004 onwards to 2013, for the first 9 to 10 years or 8 years, this particular tolerance range was 5%. Now from 2013 to 2016, it was this 1% to 3%. Now after 2016, they have introduced this range concept, which is globally prevalent and well accepted by the foreign jurisdictions as well. So they have brought about this range concept along with multiple year data. Now, when you have shortlisted the comparables as per the functional analysis requirements and as per as the filters that we have just discussed, once the comparables are shortlisted, you have to have a 3-year data which would be available for the financial analysis or quantification test. In terms of the why 3 years data, earlier there used to be a single year data that was used by the government as well as the practitioners as well. But the global scenario is that if at all you use only 1 year data, then it would not give you an actual picture of the range. It would not give you the business life cycle indication. So if at all there is a 3-year timeline which is analyzed, then a proper average or a proper arm's length range would actually be conceptualized as what the idea of the government, which is on par with the international scenario as well. So in 2014, this particular concept has come into picture. But when it comes to the comparability aspect, the number of comparables that are required for application of this range concept is minimum 6. If at all there are comparables less than 6, then you cannot apply this particular range concept. Then it will go back to plus or minus 3%, which we discussed earlier. But this range concept is applicable for TNMM, RPM, and CPM. Minimum of 6 comparables has to be there. Otherwise, it will go back to the tolerance range. And the weighted average of 3 years data has to be taken. In terms of the weights, which will be given, I can show you an example. But in terms of the PLI computation, the OP by OC or OP by OR, which is the famous PLI that is applied in transfer pricing, for any revenue related transaction, the denominator should be cost, because we are looking at an untainted ratio in terms of the PLI. In terms of cost transaction, in terms of a purchase transaction, the denominator will be OR, which is operating revenue, which is most probably the profit before interest and tax. which is the operating profit. Operating revenue is the sales. Operating cost is something which does not involve the interest component. So PBIT is what we call as the operating profit, operating cost, and operating revenue. So when we are doing a revenue transaction, we go by OP by OC benchmarking. When we are going with a purchase transaction or cost transaction, we go by OP by OR in terms of the PLI. The range concept, 35 to 65 percentile, is the range which would be applied once the 6 comparables are jotted down and then a weighted average is done. The 35 to 65 percentile range calculation will be the arm's length range that would be justified. In terms of use of multiple layer data, as I just mentioned, it has to be 3 years. If at all, for any year it is not available, minimum of 2 years data has to be available for you to select that company as a comparable. In terms of this particular single year versus multiple year, the most contradictory stands have been taken by big fours as well as the local auditors as well as the tax office category. But all in all, the act itself has been shifted to 3-year data to end that litigation, and this 3-year weighted average arm's length for multiple year data for the final list of comparables is the current ongoing benchmarking strategy. The permissible tolerance range, I think we have discussed this 1%, 3%, and 5%. Now coming to after the methods, where will I land? How will I justify? How will I document? What should I document? So for all these questions, the 92D section read with chapter 10D comes into picture. Now for this, the basic details of the ownership structure, profile, and business descriptions, as well as the price related discussion in terms of the nature and terms, description, records, and description of the methods, as we discussed the 6 methods, and the analysis out of it has to be justified. Now, what is the minimum criteria for documentation? When is the applicability of this Form 3CB and T2 documentation coming into picture? For Form 3CB, even if a 1 rupee international transaction is there, then it has to file the Form 3CB, any entity. But for detailed transfer pricing documentation as per Rule 10D, the minimum threshold has been kept to 1 crore, and there is a contemplation that this might also be increased to 5 crores or 10 crores. But as far as the current provisions are concerned, this particular transfer pricing documentation has to be maintained if and only if your aggregate value of the transactions is more than 1 crore. So these are the basic threshold limits for 3CEB and TP report. And what kind of details have to be maintained are all these details. There are 13 clauses in Rule 10D. All the 13 clauses have to be answered in whatever format that you are maintaining. Now, coming to the Form 3CEB that we are talking about, how many parts and what kind of details it requires. Now, first part is the general part, which is details of the taxpayer, which are factual in terms of PAN number, assessment year, name of the entity, address, and who's the chartered accountant and all. But in terms of the details of international transaction, what kind of transaction are you entering into with whom are you entering into, what are the details of the related party, provide description, provide value, provide method under which you are justifying. These are the 5-6 details that you are required to disclose for an international transaction in Part B. In Part C, the specified domestic transaction that we just spoke about in terms of a tax holiday claim, if any of the entities are being enjoying tax holiday, and if you are dealing with them, what kind of transactions are you subjecting it to? With this, the overall basics of transfer pricing in terms of methods, definitions, and the compliances part is done. Now we'll move into how the transfer pricing has evaluated in India in terms of the amendments, in terms of the global requirements, how India has molded itself in terms of transfer pricing. Now, whatever definition amendments that I have mentioned to you, these are year-wise budget amendments from 2012 onwards to 2020, which have all the amendments that the government has been making in terms of the evolution of transfer pricing law as such. So now section 92 has been amended for the applicability or introducing of this particular international transaction definitions. Now, whenever the amendments have been retrospective, there has been huge litigation, because by the time 2012 Finance Act came into picture, the 2006, 7, 8 assessments were happening. So when they said it is retrospectively available, the amendments went back to the past 6-7 years. So the transfer pricing authorities have started applying all the definition changes, all the conceptual changes that the Finance Act 2012 has brought in for the assessments from 2006 onwards to 2012-13 also. So there is huge litigation that is still pending at the tribunal and high court on this particular aspect. And especially after BJP government coming into picture, they have been clear that any law has to be applied prospectively and not retrospectively. Still, there are question marks on this particular applicability, but most of the tribunals have ruled that read it in the true spirit and go with the prospective effect only. Now, this was the year where domestic transfer pricing also was initiated. This was the year where advanced pricing agreements were also initiated. We will discuss in detail about advanced pricing agreements in the third or fourth segment of this presentation, where we discuss about dispute mitigation aspects on the transfer pricing. Even the safe harbor rules and the APA and the mutual agreement procedure, which is called as MAP. We will discuss all three aspects in the dispute resolution mechanisms. Now, we already spoke about tolerance range. The rollback was also initiated for the advanced pricing agreement. What is an advanced pricing agreement is any enterprise or an SSE can enter into an agreement with the government with agreed terms and conditions and with an agreed disclosure for the pricing of a particular transaction with the related party. Now, the margin of that particular transaction can be agreed with the government, and the government also will certify and specify that if at all these terms and conditions are maintained, and if these assumptions are satisfied on a year-on-year basis, then they would not touch the SSE for litigation aspect. So that's how the APA program has come into picture. This was introduced in 2012, but in 2015, they gave a 4-year rollback period option also. That means that any litigation that is pending as on this date, you can go back for 4 years and include it in the APA program and settle the litigation with the government with an agreed pricing of the margin or the pricing of the transaction. Multiple year data we just discussed, which was introduced in 2015. Now, SDT transaction threshold was increased from 5 crore to 20 crore in 2015. 92BA, 48(2)B clause was also excluded, which we have covered. BEPS, master file and CBCR. We will discuss about this master file and CBCR in the 3-tier documentation segment that we are talking about. We just spoke about transfer pricing documentation, which is a basic local file documentation, Rule 10D documentation that would justify the arm's length nature of the transactions. But there are some other 2 documentations called as master file and CBCR, which is a global requirement which is adopted by India in 2016, which would require group transactions to be disclosed, and the terms and conditions of the group transactions and the profile of the group transactions, and also the effective tax rate, the substance checks in terms of the employees, in terms of R&D, in terms of the IPs. They have a lot of questions on these 2 aspects, which we will cover in the later part of the slide. This was introduced in 2016. Now, 17-18 was another landmark year for the amendments, wherein the secondary adjustment concept was introduced, and also the interest limitation, which is famously called as the interest restriction clause, was also come into picture. Thin capitalization rules were famously called as was also introduced. We will discuss about the secondary adjustment and interest limitation in the later slides. Coming to the rest of the amendments in the recent 2 years, they have been not litigative amendments. They have been only procedural amendments in terms of rationalization, in terms of clarification, in terms of intuition of permanent establishment into the safe harbor and APA, in terms of rationalizing the thin capitalization that I just spoke about. So not much important slides. Now let's come back to the secondary adjustment, which I just spoke about in 2017 that they have introduced. What is the secondary adjustment concept? Whenever there is an adjustment that is proposed by the tax authority or the company itself during the benchmarking process comes to its knowledge, I mean, it comes to knowledge to the company that this transaction, whatever they are doing with the related party, is not at arm's length. In such a scenario, the secondary adjustment can be done as the over and above pricing of the current price that they have been doing with the related party. They can offer something to tax and bring their margin or bring the pricing to an arm's length standard. So once a primary adjustment is done, This is called as a primary adjustment that I just spoke about. Whenever your transaction or a margin is not at arm's length from a related party and third party perspective, then you can offer something to tax as a primary adjustment under income from other sources, or from the disclosure voluntary TP adjustment, it is famously called as. It's called as primary adjustment. Once this primary adjustment comes into picture, the rest of the disclosures, the rest of the money being brought back into India, say suppose this the applicability of this particular voluntary TP or secondary adjustment, the threshold limit itself is 1 crore. If it is less than 1 crore, then there is no chance of applicability of the secondary adjustment provision. Whenever the adjustment exceeds 1 crore, then there has to be a disclosure from the assessee standpoint. The assessee has to bring that money back into India within 90 days. And this is the 90-day timeline that I am talking about. Whenever the adjustment is being made by the Indian Tax Authority. Hello. So whenever the adjustment is being made by the Indian Tax Authority, whenever the adjustment is made by the taxpayer himself as a primary or voluntary adjustment, whenever the adjustment is because of the dispute resolution mechanisms, then that amount, whatever they are disclosing over and above 1 crore, if the threshold is crossing, then the entire amount has to be brought into India within 90 days from the date of the particular disclosure, or from the date of the particular adjustment in their books. Now, in terms of the time period, what will happen if I don't get this amount within the 90-day time period? The interest provisions will come into picture. You will be subjected to interest penalization on the particular amount that is being disclosed as a primary adjustment and secondary adjustment. And if the amount is not brought back into India within 90 days, then the interest will be charged on that particular amount, which is almost around MCLR plus 325 basis points and 6 months plus 325 basis points. This is the rupee denominated transaction if the foreign currency denominated transaction, or an additional income tax of 17% on such excess money, which was actually supposed to be brought, whichever is higher, can be charged by the tax authorities as a penal interest or a penal charge. Now coming to the concept of the 3-tier documentation that was introduced in 2017. Now master file is a global document which will disclose mostly all the transactions of the group entities, the terms of the group entities, the profiling of the group entities, and the details of the transaction, the description of the products and services as well. Now coming to the applicability of this particular master file, why I am supposed to disclose, what I am supposed to disclose, and when I am supposed to disclose. Now answering when I am supposed to disclose, this particular master file comes into picture if at all your transaction with the related party exceeds 50 crore in terms of the overall threshold, in terms of the wholesome number that I'm talking about, and in terms of the group turnover, if it is crossing 500 crore, then we are supposed to disclose the master file in India. And what should I disclose in the master file in the form 3CEA? What are the details that I'm required to disclose? It has 2 parts. One is the basic group detailing, who is operating in India, how many constituent entities you have in India, and what kind of group that you are dealing with. And part B of the master file contains the high level overview of the group's business operations and transfer pricing policies. Now let us see a chart to understand what is master file and what is CBCR. Now in terms of the master file and CBCR, this is the master file requirement. So what kind of details the master file asks you to file? So legal and economic ownership and business description, who is controlling the supply chain, who is supplying to whom, main geographical markets where the entire supply is going and getting sold, who are the main service providers, what kind of functional analysis, what kind of business restructuring the group has done during the year. In terms of intangibles, the R&D, who is actually initiating the R&D, where the IPs are getting registered, who is exploiting these ICs, who is exploiting the IPs in terms of generating the revenue for royalties and transfer of IPs, any kind of detailed and important transactions as far as IPC is concerned, it has to be disclosed. In terms of the financial activity, who is funding whom, from where are you getting the money, what kind of interest rates are you charging, what kind of facilities are you holding, and who takes care of all this from a financing aspect. These are the questions for the financing activities concerned from a master file perspective. In terms of consolidated financials, you are required to upload. This will give a clear picture to the tax authority in terms of storing of profits, in terms of structuring that is being done, in terms of the overall planning, transfer pricing supply chain, planning in the transfer pricing supply chain that they have done. So all in all, it will be an open book in front of the tax authority once all this information is filed. Any APA that they have agreed and entered into all over the globe. So master file, the Form 3CA Part B would consist of mostly all this 13 to 15 categories of information. In terms of CBCR, earlier we'll talk about the threshold limit of a CBCR. When is CBCR documentation applicable as such? So there are 3-layered documentations that we are talking about here. One is a local file, that is a basic transfer pricing documentation that you are required to maintain and document, which is the 92D and Rule 10D, which is the local file. Master file that we have just discussed, 50 crore and 500 crore. Now coming to country by country reporting, it's a detailed master file as far as I'm concerned. It contains a lot of information in detail, which will justify, which asks you to justify the substance, which asks you to justify the employees, which asks you to justify the capital employed in terms of tangible asset holding. So many entities at this threshold limit of 750 million euros, which are almost 6,400 crores or something, if I'm not wrong. If at all this particular threshold limit is being crossed, obviously the group entities would be planning for an effective tax rate of not less than 10%. I mean, where the top 10 to 15 companies in the world have an effective tax rate of less than 15%. That's why OECD has been very, very vigilant about this particular aspect. But my point is, at this threshold of 6,400 crores as a group turnover, the companies would have mostly identified tax jurisdictions which are, tax havens or low tax jurisdiction, and park their money there. So that would be the intention. So once this particular CBCR is filed, when the comparison starts of the profits or the money that is getting stored in jurisdiction versus the actual substance or the functions that they are performing, when a rupee to rupee mapping happens, we'll go into the contents so that you get an idea of what exactly I'm talking about. So this particular table 1 and table 2 will talk about a jurisdiction. Say suppose in Singapore, if any entity is planning to park its funds, then why are we parking its funds? What is the main business activity that Singapore is doing? If it is a paper company of just less than 10-15 employees, and if it is doing only a distribution activity, and if your effective tax or parkage of funds more than 40% of the group profits, then it is very clear and evident that none of these major activities of R&D or manufacturing and selling and marketing or any kind of main business, core business activities are not being done by it, and they do not have employees there in terms of the categorization. They do not hold assets there, but the accumulated earnings seems to be on the higher side. So once this disclosure happens from each tax jurisdiction perspective, where the revenues are going and sitting, where the profits are getting accumulated, and where the employees are sitting, where the R&D is getting accumulated, you will be able to clearly identify. So this is the intention of the Indian government, or which is on par with the global objective, to get into a situation and clearly identify where the money is getting parked and bring back the money back to India and tax it here in India. Now, coming to the various forms of master file and CBCR, the Form 3CA Part A and Part B, which is the master file, Form 3CAB, which designated entity. If there are more than one entities in India, then you can designate one of the entities which will take over the responsibility of filing the master file. That is Form 3CAB. The intimation that the main entity will not do it, but the alternate reporting entity has been selected by the parent entity to disclose and file the master file, then it is Form 3CAC. So the option has been given by the government that either the main entity, which you can call as a designated constituent entity, or an alternate reporting entity within India can file the master files and CBCRs. So this is the declaration that who will file master file among the designated constituent entity. This is the indication that who will file the CBCR in India. In terms of Form 3CEAD, the filing of CBCR is mandatory. 3CAD is mandatory, but instruction where to file if there are more than 2 constituent entities and who is getting designated are these last 4 forms are the designations which can be given if there are more than 2 or more than 1 entities here in India. Now the Form 3CAA, as we have seen the table, this is Form 3CAA content. Now Form 3CEAD, which is a CBCR, has these contents, which will make sure that the substance part or the actual justification parts along with the storage of funds is clearly evident. Now some of the definitions here in terms of group, international group, the parent entity, constituent entity, and alternate reporting entity, wherever the group is used, or wherever the consolidated financials are being reported, wherever the consolidation is getting to happen, that itself is the main parent entity, and where the consolidation is crossing 500 crores, then master file is applicable. Where the consolidation is crossing 5,500 crores, then CBCR also is required. In terms of the international group, this is on par with associated enterprise definition. Parent entity we just covered. Constituent entity is nothing but more than 1 entity being available in India and consolidation being happening. And if it is a PE or a separate business, then it has to be treated as a separate constituent entity. So coming to the base erosion and profit shifting, this is we have seen the concepts and basics of transfer pricing. We have seen how it evaluated from 2012 onwards to 2020. Now we have also seen the 3-layered documentation standards that the government has brought about. We've also seen the secondary adjustment concept which the government has brought about. Now all these are the objectives of the BEPS project that Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development has brought about. What is BEPS? Base erosion and profit shifting has been the core point of discussion from an international tax standpoint is concerned, where mostly there are 3 pillars which are the important pillars for the entire BEPS project, which is called as coherence, substance, and transparency. These are the 3 basic objectives with which the 15 action points of BEPS were introduced. Now, as far as the coherence is concerned, wherever the hybrid mismatches, the interest deductions, harmful tax practices, the avoidance of fees, all these aspects are the core litigation aspects the world is currently facing from a tax perspective is concerned. How they are escaping the tax by selecting the most appropriate tax treaties and tax jurisdictions, and how the entire planning is happening. So they have been studying this for the last 8 years or 10 years, and they have come up with certain action points which are slowly and steadily being adopted by India as well. Now we'll go into the transfer pricing aspects of this base erosion and profit shifting. Now point number 4 is an interest deduction point, which I was talking about the thin capitalization in the budget amendments that I just spoke about in 2017. What is this in thin capitalization rule? Whenever an entity is having very huge profits in any tax jurisdiction, they can showcase debt versus equity linkage for the funding of the entire business. If they use equity, then there is no expenditure against that equity until unless the flush out happens through a dividend distribution tax or a buyback. Now, when you fund the particular project with loan, then the loan repayment can also happen as well as the interest payment can also happen. So when the interest payment happens, during this interest payment capitalization, or interest payment, deduction claiming capability. The expenditure can be claimed against the profits that the entity which is having high profits can use this option as a tax efficient way of transferring the money back. Now, the claim of the interest is the main point that I'm trying to drive. Now, whenever there is an interest deduction against the profitability being claimed, when the interest deduction is more than a particular percentage of EBITDA, EBI, TDA, and earnings before interest, expense, depreciation, and amortization, whenever the interest deduction is more than a particular percentage on the EBITDA, then you are subjected to an interest limitation, which is called as thin capitalization clause. So India has adopted this thin capitalization, and it is very, very important for all the chartered accountants to know this, because most of the chartered accountants are, in my practical interactions, have not been updated on this particular aspect, that there is an interest deduction limitation of 30% of EBI TTDA from 2017, and this particular interest deduction it has to be subjected, and any interest expenditure over and above this 30% of EBITDA has to be disallowed. But you can carry forward that particular interest disallowance. I'll show you the detailed slide as well. But whenever there is a specific interest deduction over and above the 30% category that I'm just talking about, then the loss carry forward can happen for 8 assessment years. So this is the thin capitalization globally, which is well accepted concept, which is adopted by India in 2017. And please remember this 30% EBITDA concept as part of the 94B. Re-examine or transfer pricing documentation. So action point 4, action point 13 now. 4 we just discussed, 13 now. The 3-layer documentation that we just spoke about: local file, master file, and country by country reporting. In any dispute resolution mechanisms, India has adopted APA, safe harbor rules, and there is also a mutual agreement procedure, which is one of the key dispute resolution mechanism. Unfortunately, India could not achieve much success in the mutual agreement procedures, which is one of the clauses in which you can go for international level litigation resolution between two competent authorities interaction. But India US has failed to, I can say, achieve not more than 10 or less than 10 kind of situation in the last 8 to 10 years. So mutual agreement procedure is not that successful. APA is much more successful than mutual agreement procedure. Now develop an MLI from 2018 onwards. You would have been hearing about this MLI concept. This particular MLI is a comprehensive amendment. Whenever an amendment is made to any DTA, it would be called as protocol. But whenever a comprehensive amendment is being done for all similar DTAs, this particular amendments or this particular applicability of the revised scenario would be called as an MLI, the multilateral instrument. Once the countries sign to these multilateral instruments, then whatever proposals, irrespective of the existing double taxation avoidance agreements, it has to be read with these multilateral instruments, which are the revised and latest guidelines of those tax authorities or those tax jurisdictions. And the DTA read with MLI only will give you the clear picture of what that particular country has intended with the recipient country. Both payee entity and the payer have to have read the DTA along with the latest MLI, which was introduced in 2018 and with effect from 2020 onwards. Even India has signed this particular MLI, and it has adopted this for more than 100 countries. And this has to be read with, where amendments have come into picture in terms of applicability of anti-abusive provisions, in terms of principal purpose test, in terms of substance, in terms of avoidance of litigation, in terms of arbitration, in terms of there are almost around 39 clauses of this multilateral instruments divided into 7 parts. And this is one of the most important concepts that any international tax practitioner has to be aware of. And this has to be read with existing DTAs to get into a clear picture of what that country tax position as of now is. Now, implementation of BEPS in India, as I was just talking about, These are the various amendments that India has brought about on the basis of BEPS proposals. Equalization levy of 2% equalization levy, as most of you might be aware, is because of the BEPS recommendation, and e-commerce operators are required to, the recipient of the e-commerce operator has to have the 2% payment of tax, and there are specific filings that are required to be done. And this particular equalization levy, the digital tax or the digital e-commerce operators have to be subjected. And next, coming to action point 6, the bilateral negotiations are the basic anti-evasive provisions, where especially the example is India-China recently. And interest reduction, as we just discussed about the 30% EBITDA. Country by country and master file is action point 13. Action point 8 to 10 is the tax administrator and taxpayer, where they are applying to the ALP. Action point 14 is considered to be the MAP, which I have just discussed as a dispute resolution mechanism. In terms of 2018 or 2019, the MLI introduction concept is concerned, India has currently signed almost around 67 to 100 companies, 100 countries. The multilateral instrument has been signed, and most probably it is one of the revolutionary changes that India has ever done from an international transfer pricing concept is concerned. Now, coming to the concept of tax ordinance or the specificality of the 30% deduction is concerned, we just spoke about the interest payment, where the secondary the interest payment being more than 1 crore, the threshold limit, and 30% of EBITDA. Once these two conditions are getting satisfied, the excess payment of tax over and above this 30% EBITDA will be disallowed, and this can be claimed as a carry forward loss for 8 assessment years. So this 94B section is the thin capitalization rule that India has brought about in 2017. Now, the recent domestic transfer pricing amendment that the government has linked with a tax ordinance that the government has brought about in 115 BAB is that the lower tax rate. So there is a specific provision for manufacturing entities which can claim 15% corporate tax rate, and for newly proposed tax rates also the 17% or 22% effective tax rates, which will come up to 25, including such as cess. Whenever companies are adopting to this new scheme of taxation as compared to the 30% slab rate, then if at all any company within the group is adopting this new tax rate, and the existing company which is there with 30% slab is dealing with these new companies of 17% or 25%, then it has to be looked at the concept of tax holiday claim, or the distortion between the tax holiday tax payment claims. 30% company dealing with a 17% company, 30% company dealing with a 25% company, domestic transfer pricing will come into picture. This particular amendment has been brought about in 2019. 3CEB clause number 24 specifically asks about the disclosure of these particular transactions where any of the group entities domestically have adopted for this kind of 15% tax rate, and if any supplying entity or availing entity or purchasing entity is still with 30% slab rate, and this 30% company dealing with 15% also, then the disclosure of domestic transfer pricing will come into picture. From a Companies Act standpoint, section 188, which talks about the related party transaction disclosure, the same concept of ownership management control, mostly this talks about the director related party transactions, the board related party transactions, the approval of the independent audit committee, the approval of the board, approval of the shareholders, which is a similar requirement of the SEBI as well. So similar to the descriptions in terms of the related party transaction which Income Tax Act has, the Companies Act also has a definition in terms of the related party transactions, and it has to be in the ordinary course of arm's length once the related party transaction has to be entered into, and the clear disclosure requirements as per 188 is required from a board approval standpoint, and a specific requirement in AOC 4 or MGT 7 as well. But the latest SEBI circular, this is a very recent amendment which has brought about for the listed entities, if at all they are going to have any related party transactions from a listed entity standpoint, they have to report this disclosure from a related party standpoint, and they have to clearly disclose all these informations to the board and the audit committee and to the shareholders and take their approval, is what they are saying. The applicability of this particular thing would be from 1st April 2022, and this would be one of the revolutionary changes as well. And this has similar requirement of arm's length test and disclosure of related party transactions as well. Now, this is the overall scheme of things. But when we are talking about the SEBI requirement, this is the overall requirement of SEBI in terms of the disclosure of the related party and the contents of disclosure from a SEBI requirement is concerned. Now, when we are dealing with the related party transactions from Companies Act and SEBI, the discussion mostly revolves around three aspects: disclosure, approval, and arm's length concept. How do we justify this arm's length concept? It is not clear. So the methods that are suggested in Income Tax Act or from Customs Act can still be followed for justifying the arm's length nature of these transactions. When a particular file will be picked up for assessment, when a particular file will be actually picked up for full-fledged transfer pricing scrutiny. Earlier, there was a threshold limit of 15 crore for the value of the international transactions to be picked up for assessment. But now, from 2016 onwards, there is a clear requirement of a risk parameter which has to be satisfied. If at all any transaction is not disclosed, if at all any documentation is not maintained, if at all the assessing officer feels that there is a risk involved because of a related party transaction, and if the previous years of the assessee have any assessment or adjustment from a transfer pricing aspect is concerned, that is past transfer pricing litigation is there, then the files will automatically referred by the completed scrutiny selection, or the assessing officer himself can refer it to the transfer pricing authorities. So 3/2016, which talks about the risk parameters, talks about 3-4 scenarios where transaction is not disclosed, past transfer pricing litigation, and any kind of non-disclosure from assessee standpoint, which the assessing officer believes that there is a risk involved from a transfer pricing perspective. Then he can refer the file to the transfer pricing authorities. Coming to the litigation aspect of the transfer pricing, mostly the litigation revolved around selection of comparables. Transfer pricing authorities regularly select comparables which are high margin oriented companies, which is famously called as cherry picking of comparables. Now, what the judicial precedents and what safeguards that assessee has against this kind of approach is that this particular activity has to be done based on functional analysis, and there has to be a clear parameter and disclosure on how this particular company or particular comparable has been selected as a comparable in the scheme of things. So based on this approach, the litigation went up to High Court as well. But High Courts have not been entertaining appeals on the selection of comparables because they feel that there is no question of law involved, and this is a mere question of fact, which the transfer pricing authority ITAT bench is the final fact-finding authority. So they have left it to the ITAT to decide. So they have rejected the appeals which have been filed only on the basis of cherry picking of comparables aspect is concerned, which is a welcome to most of the companies which are facing litigation from a comparability standpoint is concerned. So once ITAT has given a favorable judgment in their favor, I think still even if department files an appeal before the High Court based on the Karnataka High Court, and there is also Telangana High Court and Delhi High Court which have substantiated this stand that this is not a question of law, this is only a question of fact. And once ITAT has given favorable direction in terms of assessing, then there is no going back. So please be aware of this aspect as well. Coming to the deemed inception removal of 40A2B or domestic transactions. So as I mentioned in the amendments, 40A2B was removed in 2016 from the gamut of 92BA domestic transfer pricing requirements. So there were few litigations that have happened from 2012 to 2016 where that 40A2B clause existed for domestic transfer pricing transactions. And there is a famous ruling of Bangalore tribunal which says that this particular amendment was made and it was removed, and it was existing for only 4 years. And when it is removed, it was removed with an intent that it was covered under the regular clause of 48B. So the tribunal has mentioned that this is a deemed omission from inception. So there is no requirement of 48B to be disclosed anywhere. If there is non-disclosure litigation, if there is any litigation on the pricing aspect of this 48B transactions, then it will not be subjected to test from a transfer pricing perspective, and it has to be deemed to be deleted from inception. Intangibles, or the advertisement, marketing and promotion expenditure, which is famous litigation in transfer pricing, especially in the north side and Bangalore also. So this particular marketing intangible talks about spent on advertisement, marketing and promotion and promoting a foreign brand in India and not getting anything in return. Say suppose LG has done a World Cup in 2011, it has spent a lot of money on advertisement, marketing and promotion, but still it has disclosed very good margins at a net level and that benchmarked itself under TNMM. The tax authority has said that, okay, at net level you are good, you are doing well, but what about the effort and the cost that you have incurred on the advertisement, marketing, promotion of a Korean brand? Now for this, you should have got something in return from your parent entity. And on this particular aspect, a famous bright line test has been brought about into picture. What kind of quantum of AMP expenditure is being incurred by the SSC as compared to the rest of the industry? They used to test this advertisement, marketing, promotion expenditure quantum, and they used to justify whether it is a within the range kind of expenditure without any compensation from the global entity, or you are required to actually get something out of the global entity. Most of the rulings have been in favor of the SSC, but it is one of the most famous litigations, the AMP part. Now coming to the issuance of guarantee, and when I was talking about the initial definition part on international transaction, the financing aspect has a particular word called as guarantee. Now whenever an outbound guarantee is being given by the Indian entity, Indian parent to its global subsidiary, the government's expectation is that it has to charge something as a guarantee fee, which an independent any financing or a banking entity would do. Now how much guarantee to be charged, how the conceptualization or quantification has to be made, there is no clear guidance anywhere in the act. But as far as the foreign jurisdiction is concerned, as far as various tribunal rulings and as far as the benchmarking of the big fours or the best practices is concerned, any kind of interest savings which the global entity makes after the guarantee is being initiated by the Indian entity, there is, suppose with guarantee it is 13%, without guarantee it is 18%. The 5% benefit that the subsidiary entity has got has to be charged by the Indian parent entity here in India. Now this amendment has also been brought into picture in 2004 as a retrospective, but various high courts and various tribunals have done it prospective effect, and also the litigation has put an end for most of the high court, and in most of the high court rulings saying that this is not part of the international transaction definition, or the intention of the government was to subject this guarantee in terms of actual course of business. If the SSC is in the course of banking, finance, or that kind of business, then only this guarantee transaction has to come into picture. If it is given as part of the ownership regulatory, if it is given as part of a piece of paper, as part of the documentation of the banking regulation procedures, then it should not be subjected to transfer pricing. So there are true and false judgments in this, but mostly in favor of the SSC. So these are some of the famous judgments which cover this guarantee aspect of the litigation. Coming to the delay in receivables part, whenever the receivables are received in delay from the associated enterprise, should an interest be charged on that delay or not? In an independent scenario, if you are not charging any interest, say suppose you deal with related party, you also deal with third party. In both the scenarios, you have not charged interest, then that is one of the arguments for you to take it up, and you can say that it's my policy that I don't charge interest. I give them an overall 180-day time period, 90-day time period, and if then only if they pay within that timeline, I do not charge interest. Then similar stand can be taken for related party transactions as well. But imputation of interest on these receivables when the principal transaction is at arm's length. We say suppose my sale transaction is at arm's length, I'm making very good profit, and this is compared under TNMM or CUP or other methods, and I have been successful in justification, tax authority has also accepted. But the receivable, which is a closely linked transaction, which is coming out of the sale transaction itself, there is a delay, whether I have to charge interest on that and how much interest is to be charged. These are the two questions that have landed up in litigation. So if at all you are able to justify that it is a common practice that both related party and third party, I don't charge interest, and if this is only a closely linked transaction, and if a working capital adjustment has been done along with the sales benchmarking is concerned, when a sales benchmarking is done and when a sales benchmarking happens along with the working capital adjustment, then there should not be a imputation of interest on the receivables part. So mostly this litigation has revolved around the imputation of interest on receivables, but as far as the principal transaction, once it is benchmarked and accepted to be at arm's length, there is no scope of interest imputation. Again, is the core principle with which most of the assessees have been coming out with clearance from the high courts and tribunals. Now coming to the benefit test aspect, this is one of the important aspects where intra-group services are being provided to any of the group entities, and if the pricing of that particular intra-group service, say suppose management support services and marketing support services, or any kind of transfer pricing policy being implemented by the parent entities without charge of the service, or even if they are charging, if the pricing of that particular charge is not being accepted by the tax authority, they have been questioning on the benefit or the entire gamut of value identification the supply chain has contributed to those management support services. So to justify this particular benefit test, most of the companies have been maintaining documentation of the emails, the transfer pricing regulation, the cost contribution arrangements, and also they have been providing a lot of material of their group policy. But the tax authorities have been disregarding all that, and they have been saying that this is mere transfer of profit from one entity to the other, and there is no specific requirement of this particular intra-group payment. And they have been justifying the arm's length to be zero, and they have been disallowing the entire intra-group transaction. So that is how the litigation has been revolving around intra-group service. But most of the litigations, once they reach tribunal, and once the tribunal is of the opinion that this particular documentation which they have submitted is foolproof and it is justifying the benefits that the Indian entity has achieved in getting the value benefit before they transfer this money, or after they transfer this money as a cost contribution arrangement to the global entity, then the entire acceptance from a marketing support service or management fee that I was just talking about as an intra-group service is accepted by the tribunals. Especially Hyderabad and Chennai have been accepting the intra-group service payments, but Bangalore, there are two other judgments which are against. But these are the summary of judgments which are in favor of the assessee on this particular aspect. Coming to penalties, when the overall assessment, we'll first cover the assessment procedures. In terms of the overall reference part, now the references are coming from the National Faceless Assessment Center. But once the risk parameter is picked up by the competent scrutiny selection team, this particular risk parameter goes to the local TP office. The transfer pricing assessments are currently being done by the local transfer pricing authorities in their particular jurisdictions in the local cities itself, but not with the the faceless scheme. But most probably by next year, this should also move to the faceless scheme is what they are contemplating. Once the TPO does his assessment, draft order will be issued. From there, 30 days timeline will optional timeline will be given, and within that 30 days, assessee has to select whether he wants to go to the DRP or whether he can go to the CIT appeals. Once the litigation ends there, it's all good. Otherwise, they have to go to tribunal within another 60 days from there. So the point is, the whole reference standpoint to the TPO to the High Court or the ITAT level might take around 4 to 4.5 years is as a timeline perspective. There's a flow chart which gives you an indication of how much timeline and what procedure and what flow the litigation, transfer pricing litigation happens in India. Now, when I was talking about the faceless scheme, the transfer pricing division would most probably fall under the technical units. Government is yet to form these technical units. There have been regional faceless assessment centers, but and verification units, but technical units are yet to be formed. So the transfer pricing assessments are still going on at the local jurisdictional offices itself. So these are the alternative dispute resolution mechanisms that I was talking about: safe harbor rules, the mutual agreement procedures, and APA. For safe harbor rules, we need to file a particular form with the government saying that I am satisfying the definitions of a particular transaction. The government has given definitions for IT, ITS, and other transactions, and you have to prove that you are falling within those definitions of the international transaction, and you have to file a specific form by 31st January immediately after the written filing deadline. And this particular form will be shifted to the transfer pricing authority where a detailed scrutiny will be done. And within 2 months of the timeline, the CIT of the particular jurisdictional CIT has to pass the approval order whether this particular compliance is okay from the SSC standpoint and whether the margins that they are disclosing against the definitions. Say suppose for software and ITS transactions, the margin has been justified at 17% or 18%. The 100 crore turnovers are not crossed. For a 100 crore company, for less than 100 crore company, for a software, the margin which has been defined as 17%, if you are accepting that 17% already, then you can file that form with the tax authority and justify your definition and margin and the terms of the transaction, and the government will accept this particular application and give you a clearance from a litigation standpoint is concerned. So most probably this particular definitions are being evaluated and the applicability is evaluated, and this particular safe harbor applications are processed. But in my practical experience, not many safe harbor applications have been processed as a date. Advanced pricing arrangements on the other side have been very successful program right from 2012 onwards. So these are other channels of dispute resolution mechanisms where any assessee can apply to the government asking for advanced pricing agreements, and they can actually justify their margins, and there will be a clear negotiation procedure also which will be given as an opportunity to the assessee. So the unilateral applications, that is with the Indian taxpayer and the government, bilateral is between two governments, and multilateral is with more than two governments getting involved. So globally this is a very famous concept, but India has adopted this in 2012. So any taxpayer who has litigation on his mind and who wants to be away from litigation can file this application clearly defining his terms of transaction, his description of transaction, his group transfer pricing policy, and the margin that he wants to maintain, and the justification of such margin. And there will be a specific site visit that also will be adopted by the tax authorities, and the tax authorities would come to the assessee's premises and verify the records and interact with the employees and the main management. And then a negotiation phase will be given to this particular advanced pricing agreement conclusion is concerned. So this is one of the most famous practical way of dealing with the things where assessees would want to avoid litigation or transfer pricing litigation is concerned. Now these are the various 4 phases that I was talking about: pre-filing, APA request, and evaluation, and execution and monitoring. Once the APA is signed, the assessee would be filing an annual compliance report on par, providing the details of the assumptions, the terms and conditions, and the margins he is maintaining. There will be an audit that would be done on the annual compliance certificate, that compliance report that the assessee is filing. And if at all the term of APA, that is 5 years moving forward and 4 years rollback, if it is over, then they can go for a renewal, or in between if they want to revoke or cancel also, there is a provision. So I wanted to talk about penalties as well. So what will it happen if I don't disclose? What will happen if I don't maintain? There are specific penalty provisions for transfer pricing. So it most probably revolves around 2% of the international transaction, but 100 to 300% of the transaction values also might be leading to this particular disclosure penalties, and in the most probable reporting structure. So 271G, 271AA, 271C, these are the various penalty sections that one can think of. But in terms of master file and CBCR, which are the latest amendments, there are huge penalties per day as well as consolidated penalties as well. So for furnishing of this particular 3-layered documentations, the master file CBCR, government has been vigilant on who's not filing since 2017. I think the latest assessments that are current ongoing assessments will have a lot of discussion on this particular penalty sections as well. Now, the due dates for the current ongoing filing season is concerned. My transfer pricing documentation, because of COVID, the extended timelines are there. So 31st January 2022 is the overall time limit for maintaining and filing the form, maintaining the documentation and filing the form 3CB. Master file is given another 1 month to file, that is 28th February. If at all an entity is crossing 1 crore, then 3CEAB also has to be filed, where more than one entity is there for reporting of master file is concerned. Then a particular entity has to be nominated for the purpose of master file filing. So remember 31st January 2022 and 28th February, which are the deadlines for the 3CB TP report and master file. CBCR is also 31st January 2022, but the applicability of this might be very huge, 6,400 crores. So let's take a stop here and see the questions or anything, and then maybe I'll take you through the pillar 1, pillar 2 of it in the last 5 to 10 minutes.
Hello. Yes, sir.
Yes, can someone present the questions? What are the questions that?
No, we have one question, only one question as of now. I just share my screen. Many were asking for a presentation, just to revise back, and maybe there might be a question post that. So is my screen visible, sir?
Yeah.
I'm sure.
In case of an ECB received from foreign parent company, should we disclose only the interest portion in 3CB, or should we disclose the principal amount received or repaid? See, the 3CB asked for the interest component. Yes, your first question, your interpretation is correct, that you have to disclose the interest component and the interest rate as well. But on the outstanding component, if at all you are confused on whether the principal component or the outstanding component has to be disclosed, please disclose it in other transaction if at all you are confused about it, because any kind of receivable payable also might be questioned, that the principal transaction itself is not disclosed. What will happen practically is the transparency authorities go by the related party schedule, which is being disclosed in the financials. So the interest component as well as the outstanding component both will be appearing there. Yes, your objective of disclosing the transaction which is affecting the P&L account is actual interest transaction, but once they are not identifying the outstanding balance which is appearing in the related party versus what is there in the 3CB, there might be a litigation. So please disclose it in the residuary clause as an outstanding transaction also. So this is my answer. Hope I have answered the question. So
Yes, sir. So
any other questions?
we'll look for their complimentary messages, and there many were requesting for a PPT, so we can share this PDF file.
We can share the PPT. That should not be a problem.
Yeah, we'll share it post completion of the session in 1 or 2 days with the recording to all the participants.
I'll spend some 5 to 10 minutes on pillar 1 and pillar 2, which is the go-to concept.
Yeah, I'll give you the rights back. You can just continue with it. If there's any question, we'll take it up later.
Okay. So the next phase of transfer pricing or international tax would most probably be this phase, where OECD for the past 8 years has been working on these BEPS projects or the pillars of the presentations that that we have just made on the action points. But they have come out with 2 pillars and the statement pillars, which are pillar 1 and pillar 2. Most probably, this will be the turning point where the tax structuring that has been done till now has to be revamped or reevaluated by all the MNEs of the group. So this is the phase in which the OECD has gone till now, and they have come up with 2 pillars, pillar 1 and pillar 2. Most probably the OECD along with the G20 countries has formed this 15 action points which we discussed earlier in the slides. But when it comes to these 2 pillars, what exactly are this pillar 1 and pillar 2? What do they address? What do they do? Now coming to these 2 pillars, they are mainly focusing on ensuring minimum taxation to be paid. When I spoke earlier, I was saying that almost the top 10, 15, 20 companies of the globe are not even having an effective tax rate of 8 to 15%, which is mind-boggling. But they have been planning it in such a way that they are taking advantage of the tax havens and low tax jurisdictions as well. But whenever the minimum taxation rule, the main objective of pillar 2 is that they want to get a minimum taxation of 15% into picture, irrespective of the tax holiday of any specific jurisdiction. So when they get this particular minimum taxation into picture, the entire tax structuring that MNEs have done till now will go for a toss. And to cope up with different tax systems or tax credit mechanisms and different operating systems of the businesses, they want to formulate a uniform pricing or uniform taxing mechanism and ensure transparency and credit mechanism, and also avoid double taxation simultaneously. So this is pillar 2. But what about the pillar 1? What it exactly talks about? It talks about 2 amounts, amount A and amount B. Amount B specifically talks about marketing and distribution activities and apportionment of the ALP for such activities, which are famously called as LRDs, limited risk distributors, or marketing and distribution functions, a fixed return being given to them. What do you call as fixed return? Whenever you are dealing with any distributor or supplier, this particular fixed return can be given to him as a margin over and above his cost. So a cost plus pricing strategy or cost plus mechanism based on the functions that is adopting in the local jurisdictions has to be given as a fixed return to these distributing entities. This is amount B. Now coming to the complicated aspect of amount A. What happens in amount A is a taxing right is being given for market jurisdictions over and above the residual profit. What is called as the residual profit and what is called as non-residual profit? In terms of an example, if you are seeing when any global entity is performing or when any global entity is operating, there is a specific component of a routine profit which can be identified based on the industry in which they are. In terms of an example, if we are looking at it here, the profit allocation of a routine and residual profits is being done and the threshold limit is 10% as per the OECD current statement. Now 25% of the fixed reconciliation is used to allocate profits. Now after the routine profit, wherever the non-routine profit is coming into picture over and above the routine profit, say suppose in Singapore the R&D functions earn a profit of around 15%, and in a specific client, if we observe it is earning as 30%, the 15% excess will go into this zone of non-routine profit. So what this amount A talks about is redistributing this non-routine profit to other functionally identifiable markets where there is specific identification happening from an activity, from a profitability, from a market connection and pro rata collection standpoint, and also eliminate double taxation. So what they are doing is any profit which is over and above the routine profit, which gets distributed into local jurisdictions which are performing functions as per their functional analysis. In terms of, say, suppose this is an example. Now a particular entity has $25,000, 25,000 euros as revenue, and has a profit of 6,500 euros. The profitability margin is 26%. Now this is a group. Now, when it comes to a specific 3 subsidiary market jurisdiction is concerned, they have market of local revenues of 218 and 5, and there is total revenue of 25,000, which there is on a total revenue standpoint. Now, arriving at the non-residual or non-routine profit, we have to remove the 10% profitability of the revenues. What is the total revenue here? 25,000. So remove 10% of 25,000 from the profit after tax of the group and arrive at the overall non-routine profit. When this non-routine profit is to be further bifurcated among the 3 jurisdictions, it has to be done in a way that 25%, what we spoke about earlier here as a 25% fixed reallocation strategy, which the OECD is suggesting, we are doing a 25% of 4,000, which is 1,000 euros, getting diverted into a market jurisdiction perspective in the proportion in which their revenues are. So allocation key of this particular thing gets into 8%, 72% and 20% based on their contributions. So the 1,000, which is the non-routine profit which we have arrived, is getting allocated among the 3 jurisdictions in such a way that the contributions or the functional analysis or the entire allocation keys are driving them towards. So this is the criteria in which the allocation might happen in the future, is what the TP rules are also might get amended for this particular purpose. Tax administrations also might work towards this, but this is the amount A concept that the OECD has been suggesting. What are the threshold limits and for whom this amount A is applicable? For automated digital service providers and for consumer facing businesses. Most probably these consumer facing businesses will be like, you know, Swiggy's and Zomato's and other guys. But for advertisement and online platform guys, this will be a huge hit because the identification of the source, the payer and the recipient is a big problem, because their identification would be done based upon various criteria, that is activity test, profitability test and market connection test. Where are you actually performing the activity, whose profit, who is eating, and where the market actually is getting connected to. Most probably the shift will be towards the end profitability, where it is getting stored. So from there it gets reallocated to the jurisdictions where the actual profits are getting earned. There is a specific threshold limit of $20 billion, which is somewhere around 1,70,000 INR maybe, which is very huge. I don't think any Indian entity operating in automated digital service has reached there. But in terms of the nexus of local revenue, definitely I think there will be few companies which will satisfy this local revenue standpoint. So these are the businesses which might get impacted because of this amount A pillar 1, and this is the threshold in which this applicability might be driving towards, and this is how the reallocation of profits might happen in the future. So this is one of the revolutionary suggestions that has been made in the last 3-4 years, but they're also making sure about the implementation, transparency, avoidance of double taxation, etc., along with reallocation rights. But this dispute prevention might have to be vigilantly observed by the governments also while adopting this particular option, because it is very confusing and it might lead to huge litigation, cross-border litigation, that too. So this thing is one of the very important changes that you may have to go through in the existing scheme of things in the next 1-2 years. Applicability of the global minimum tax rate that I was just talking about, they are contemplating that minimum of 15% top-up tax has to be implemented in any jurisdiction, and the minimum threshold for this is 750 million euros for pillar 2, so which will be around 6,400 INR. But what will happen on this top-up tax is that any subsidiary of India, say suppose India has a subsidiary in Dubai or Singapore where the tax rate are less than 15%, then for those profits which are being stored in Dubai, the entire profit will be taxed in India at a minimum tax rate of 15%. That's the proposal. Now, wherever there is a non-disagreement, or whenever there is any IIR, the income inclusion rule, not being taken up, there might be a anti-evasion rule that might come into picture, which might be like denying the deduction of the payments, imposing additional withholding tax irrespective of the DTAs. This is the other alternative that they are trying to impose. So the top-up tax of 15% over and above, if at all they are low tax jurisdictions, and denies deductions and imposing of withholding tax rate is the key. If at all anybody is having over and above 15%, then there is no problem. You will be given a additional tax credit mechanism, which we will discuss. If at all anybody is paying less than 15% of this particular IIR, then the reverse scenario of additional payment has to be coming into picture. So carve outs and carry forward that I was just talking about, you can carry forward for 7 years the IIR tax credit if at all anybody is paying more than the 15% tax rate that I'm talking about. But carve outs, there are few exemptions, or there are few claim of expenditures which can be allowed as far as this taxation of 15% profit is concerned. Out of the profit where the jurisdictional right of taxing is being allowed, there is a specific deduction of 5% on the tangible assets and also a 10% on the payroll that can be claimed as a deduction, which is called as a carve out from a OECD perspective is concerned. So this particular carve outs also will be applicable as an exclusion from the profits that are getting shifted for taxation of a minimum IIR. Now, for whom this pillar 2 won't apply, these are government entities, international organizations, NPOs, the pension funds, or ultimate parent entities of any group or any holding vehicles. For these entities, I don't think they will be going ahead and applying this. But the point that other 2 important criteria of pillar 2 we have to understand or remember is, if at all there is a PE, permanent establishment, in a low tax jurisdiction, the profit has to be first allocated to that low tax permanent establishment, and the permanent establishment profit attribution has to be taxed at minimum IIR. So if there is a PE in a low tax jurisdiction, and if it is not getting taxed at a minimum IIR, first we have to attribute profits as per the profit allocation rules, and then apply this particular IIR to that particular permanent establishment. And this particular switchover rule of profit allocation and minimum IIR applicability would be done to the permanent establishments in low tax jurisdictions. Subject to tax rule, other important concept of pillar 2 is that wherever there is a treaty abuse happening or any treaty benefits that are being claimed from a structuring standpoint is concerned, the paying entity, if at all it's enjoying any benefit, it has to be taxed as per the source rule. Or if the source rule is having a low tax jurisdiction, the payer entity has to tax it based on the payer entity jurisdiction. That is shifting of tax rights from the source country to the paying entity, and that too being subjected to a minimum tax rate is called a subject to tax rules. So the ultimate concept of pillar 2 is minimum of 15% has to be applied, and if there is a specific tax credit mechanism that comes into picture because of the haphazard or low tax or high tax jurisdictions, there will be a tax credit mechanism that will be given. If at all carve outs can be claimed on the gross block of or the carrying value of the assets as well as the payroll cost, that carve out or incentives can be claimed. And also the PE attribution rules along with IIR read together is a switchover rule. And the final thing would be the taxing rights transfer. If at all the other jurisdiction is not agreeing to this pillar 2, then the taxing rights should be subjected to the paying entity at a minimum IIR concept rule. India will soon agree and sign this particular pillar 2 is what Nirmala Sitharaman in her statement has also mentioned. So most probably by 2022 or 23 that this concept might come into picture from an international tax and transfer pricing is concerned. Any questions from anybody?
So we have another 2 more questions.
Yeah. So domestic QJV is not concerned under TP, while the same is concerned a related party. Will their assessing or expected to assess to prove a domestic joint venture? I think what is he trying to say? Is not considered under TP, while the same is considered under related party transaction. See, transfer pricing authority will go as per the definition of 92B. So once the local joint venture is not claiming any of 80IA or 10A tax holiday, then you can always write in the representation if he is litigating that neither of the entities, either the assessee nor the joint venture, are engaged in any tax holiday. So there is no applicability of transfer pricing. So there is no concept of arm's length that is required to be proved. However, if you are still falling under 48(2)(b) definition from joint venture perspective, if at all it is an EPC or construction company, then you have to justify the arm's length or the justification from a 48(2)(b) standpoint is concerned, and you have to report that in the tax audit report. That is a separate discussion altogether. But from a TP standpoint, you can always argue that neither of the entities are engaged in any tax holiday claim, and if at all their value is also not exceeding 20 crores, then there is no question of transfer pricing being applicable. The current assessment proceedings are very aggressive in nature for IT MNCs. Further, they give 3 to 5 days time to respond SCNs every year as they take up TP audits close to deadline. How do we manage this crisis? See, the transfer pricing assessments are to be, from a auditor standpoint or from company standpoint, we need to be ready with the documentation, policies, and the positions as on the date of filing the Form 3CB itself. That is why it is called as contemporaneous documentation. So most of the companies and most of the auditors don't prepare documentation and they wait till the assessment notice to come. So if at all you're ready with the documentation, positions, and the benchmarking analysis at the time of 3CB itself, I don't think it should be a problem for you to go back. But if it is a specific show cause notice, you need to have a subject matter expert to help you out, because I can understand if they are coming out with comparables and all this kind of adjustments that the show cause notice proposes. Then within that timeline, if you are able to correspond to all the details and go back, then you can always file the SCN reply with the help of a subject matter expert. Or if you are still not able to do, and if it is only 2-3 day working day time period that is given to you, you can always raise a principle of natural justice ground before the appellate authorities and make sure that it is remanded back to you, and sufficient timeline is given to you again for response. So these are my 3 suggestions to you.
So
Any other questions?
Yeah, those were the questions. If there's any, maybe we'll share it to you over mail later. So for us, so SAGs over to you, sir.
Yes, sir. So thank you, sir, Mithilesh, sir. It was really wonderful, and I think you have gone into detail of the transfer pricing, which shows your expertise in this field, and you have thrown us the light of the future trends to happen. And I, on behalf of SARC and on behalf of the participants of today, thank you for your wonderful time and accepting to address this seminar. And I thank you all the participants for making this seminar a grand success. Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mithilesh.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thanks.
Thank you all.